Welcome everybody to day 2 of the Stronger Conference. I'm Patrick O'Reilly. I'm the founder and chief innovation officer of CyberSaint. We've got a wonderful panel today collected to talk on a topic that is really near and dear to my interests and my heart. So we're going to focus on the heightened responsibilities and potential personal liabilities that CISOs face in light of the new SEC cyber risk reporting rules. We're going to center the discussion on understanding materiality. We'll kick that around a little bit, the implications of the regulations on executive roles and how that's shifting, and strategies for mitigating and effectively communicating company risk to reduce personal liability. The panel is bringing together leading experts in cyber, legal compliance, and executive leadership to provide comprehensive insights and practical advice for navigating this complex landscape. Like I said, I'm Patrick O'Reilly. I'm the founder and chief innovation officer. I have Kara, Manju, and Tamika here with me. I'm going to pass it to Kara to give a brief introduction, and then we'll go around the horn and we'll jump right in.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here today. My name is Kara Bradley. I am the Vice President and Deputy General Counsel at Everbridge, which is a Boston-based SaaS software company focused on critical event management.
Manju,
yeah.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Manju Bade. I'm based in Austin, Texas. I am a CISO and a cyber practitioner for 25 years. Right now, my focus is on technology and financial services in terms of the CISO landscape in public companies. And I have also helped and lived through things like the Yahoo breach. So lots of experience there. Thank you.
Awesome. Good morning. My name is Tamika Bass. I am the cybersecurity director at a merged company now, Gannett Fleming Trans Systems. I have about 20 years experience in the cybersecurity field, so I'm looking forward to the conversation today.
So am I. This topic has been really big in our space, and it's not always easy to get at some of the subtleties of it all, and there's so much going on and so much to discuss here. So I'm just going to start with you, Manju. How has the role of the CISO evolved over the past decade, and what have been the key drivers of this change as you see it?
Thank you for the question. Patrick, I was first a CISO in 2014, and it has absolutely been a decade. I've seen that the federal government cares a lot more.
Yes.
The federal government's a lot more involved. We had, 10 years ago, we had NIST, we had SOC 2, we had PCI, and those were drivers for us doing many of the business and regulatory compliance needs that we needed to do as CISOs. But now it's an extra layer where there's federal government accountability for public and even non-public organizations in some sectors. And that's kind of tightened and heightened the role of a CISO. The role of the CISO used to be go stay in your tech corner and do your tech things, sandwich CTO or CIO. And now it's a business conversation. Now you're invited to the boardroom, partially because of the federal regulations, but also the observations of all the disasters over the last decade have forced businesses to care about this as a business problem and also a business opportunity, saying that your products are extra safe and keeping them extra safe and with the right cyber hygiene is actually a business differentiator. So it can work on both fronts. And I've seen the CISOs be involved on both fronts, the regulatory front and the business opportunity front.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've been watching it too because we work so closely with executives, and there's a kind of reaction a little bit around, I need to be more in the middle of the business conversation. And I think corporations historically, and it depends on the sector, but there was some, you're the technical people, you can stay over there with the technical issues. And when you come in here and talk about what you need or what's going on, try not to drag all the technical issues in. And that, I think, unduly constrains some of the conversations. The SEC has definitely changed the equation. So in what way have lines of reporting for the CISO role changed in the last 10 years in relation to technical versus business leaders, and why is this so? Kara, we'll go to you on that one.
Sure. And so, yeah, I think a lot of, kind of echo what Manju said, right? The traditional corporate governance structure was to have the CISO focus more on internal systems and internal products. And so it made a little more sense to report onto a CIO that's a little more focused on the internal IT applications. And to be sure, from some of the statistics I've seen, probably roughly about half of US companies still have the reporting structure. It's probably even more internationally. But I think given the heightened increased sensitivity to cyber risk, particularly as a focus of enterprise risk management, and the time and attention that senior executives and boards are spending on this has really tried to elevate the role. And so I've seen it a bunch of different ways. I think more typically you often might see it to a COO if it's a more operations focused role. For companies in the financial services or financial services adjacent, if you have a risk officer, that seems to be a really good place to put that focus. And I think occasionally you see it at smaller companies reporting into the legal team. I think that's probably works at a smaller organization. As organizations start to scale, I think you're trying to elevate the role and get them get the CISO in front of the right people. But I think the core concern is what is the CISOs aren't just focused on internal operations. Breaches and cyber issues affect reputational issues, customer relations with customers, and can cost a fortune to remedy. And so, given the importance of cyber in the overall risk portfolio that companies are dealing with, CISOs need to be able to have access to those people. And even if they are still reporting through a CIO reporting structure, having access to the board, having access to senior leadership is really important, for a more modern organization.
Excellent. Yeah. So, on the other side of the house, boards, I think are more aware now, because it's mentioned pretty explicitly in some of the rules, that, they need better reporting. They need to be better informed. So how do security teams, maintain control while meeting these growing demands, while also, tailoring their communication for maximum effectiveness? Tamika, we'll go to you on that one.
Or yeah, I think it's really about paying attention to the data that's available about incidents and cyber attacks in your particular industry, and sharing that information with the board, right? I think helping the board understand the risk that are in the environment, and really just having those two-way conversations. A lot of times you see, and talking about reporting structure, a lot of times you see people that report to the CIO. Sometimes the CISO doesn't have the ability to have those conversations. A lot of times things are going through the CIO. So I think it's removing some of those boundaries, those roadblocks, and letting the CISO actually communicate with the board and present data, because that is really what gets their attention, especially cyber attacks and incidents that are happening out there. One example is, and this is kind of not in the public sector entity, but this thing that just happened with a company, and I won't say the name, reporting or being accused of false reporting to the their SPRS score, right? And putting a score in that they didn't really have, right? So that's in the news now. So it's amazing how the board start asking questions about, hey, what are we reporting? What does our score look like? Because of incidents that they see out there, it brings it to their attention. So I think it's really about paying attention to the data that is available and making sure that you're intentional about communicating that information to the board.
Right, and that's great. And I think we've seen, you know, just in some of the early enforcement actions, a little bit of, you know, what I say publicly, or, you know, what is on record, the company, you know, is saying about their security posture, you know, can become an issue after the event. You know, if regulators, you know, we had an advisor for years here, a guy named John Wheeler. And he said, you know, he was involved in the first enforcement actions under Sarbanes-Oxley. And when the regulators came in there, they were fixated on that public disclosure versus what's really going on inside the company. And I think the communication and the emphasis on communication is so important, because you know, there shouldn't be an incentive to hide stuff, and there shouldn't be heavy incentives to not want to know things either. That's going to lead to less than optimal outcomes. So the new SEC reporting requirements are evaluative. They're value-based, you know, and companies are getting comfortable with what they include in disclosures. It's been fascinating to watch that all play out. Has the process on the legal and governance side led to closer alignment with information security teams, Kara?
We're certainly seeing that, and if you haven't felt that alignment and you're in a public company, you should work on it. You know, in some ways, the companies have always had to disclose material risk to the organization, you know, if you're an SEC filer. And so, right, material financial risks have to get run by your finance team. Material legal risks need to be vetted by your legal team. You know, material cyber risks have always needed to be run through, you know, whatever part of your organization is in charge of reviewing and evaluating those risks. That part isn't really different. I think the more you know, focus by the SEC and these more specific rules have kind of forced a lot of companies to elevate the conversation, and I think to give it another, you know, thought process around not just what risks are disclosed, but the governance and the information flow between the organization of how you understand and evaluate these type of risks. And so, right, that has forced, well, encouraged, you know, legal and finance teams who are probably often running your financial reporting processes and your public reporting to get more involved in that communication flow with your CISO organization. You know, I think the part that's, you know, with any new SEC rules, there's always kind of a wave of rules get introduced, takes a while to get them to be effective and final. And now we're kind of in that beginning stages of seeing what everyone else is doing. It's a great time to learn about what your competitors are doing if they're publicly listed, because now that's all out in the open. And I think over time, you'll see disclosures start to kind of mirror each other as people look to see what their other people in their industries are doing. One thing that I think that is kind of an interesting stage of where we are in terms of rule enforcement, you know, after you have the rule enforced, you'll see often interpretive guidance released to help clarify any confusion. And then you'll eventually start to see enforcement actions to see what regulators like the SEC are interested in. You know, I think in particular, their focus has been, as you said, Patty, to are you doing internally what you're telling the external public that you're doing? You know, throw on top of that, the Supreme Court just reversed the Chevron doctrine, which calls into question the ability of administrative agencies like the SEC to enforce some of these rules. And so I think we may be in a little bit of a waiting game, in that, you know, we may see less enforcement going forward. No one really knows at this point, but I think, you know, given the how and when administrative agencies are able to enforce these type of rules, certainly is kind of called into question. And I think, you know, we'll eventually, for the time being, force companies to make some of these decisions internally, as opposed to be able to kind of look to enforcement for guidance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's fascinating. You know, like we needed another wrench thrown into the mix. Yeah.
Throw it all into the fire.
Everyone's getting ready to start doing cyber risk management a little with more transparency, and then the Supreme Court weighs in and says maybe that's not even enforceable. So Tamika, do you believe that the rules are moving the needle? Like, have you seen any real effects in your in your day to day? And is it happening just is beyond public companies? Is this going downstream a bit?
So I think it's moving the needle for public companies. There's more and more talk about it. We hear it in all the conferences that we attend now. Everything is SEC. But I can't say that it's really moving the needle for beyond public companies, right? I work at a company that is not public, so I don't really worry about it, but as I have enough to really worry about. So, like we have our day-to-day jobs, we have so much to worry about. So it's, I don't typically worry about it, but it does force me to keep my eyes and my ears open and understand the rules, because you really never know, right? So it's public companies today, but it could be everybody tomorrow. So you just never know when you're going to be impacted. So I think it's an opportunity for education for all companies, for all cyber professionals. But I don't think that it's going beyond the public companies yet. I really don't.
Interesting, very interesting. Yeah, and I mean, if anything, I've seen, companies come in that to our to our software, and if they're not under the regime, they love inheriting some of the maturity that we can provide them with around cyber risk. But you're right, it doesn't seem to be quite as pressing. I'm just gonna frame the next segment with a little ramble here, so bear with me. I think part of the, Gary Gensler is he's an economist. So I think he tends to look at the market and outcomes and talk about driving efficient outcomes. And the problem historically in cyber, I think we've all been around it long enough to know, is that the practice of cyber can get complicated quickly. It's not always easy to force transparency onto a practice that has some elements of the technical that get a little bit tough to describe at times. I've likened it maybe at times to the practice of writing manuscripts in the Middle Ages. It can be a secretive process in some ways, and it's not intentionally secretive. It grows out of IT culture growing up alongside other business functions and having their own internal culture. Gensler says basically that there should be a mechanism, right, to get from that sort of information into the share price, into what a reasonable investor might want to know, right? So that to me is fascinating. How do you take specialist information? How do you take information that CISOs and information security teams work with, and then frame that so that there's some understandable information that may or may not impact what a reasonable investor might want to know. So, in theory, all of this should lead to more efficient outcomes in cyber risk management, but even more efficient outcomes in the economy writ large, right? So if we make better decisions, right, we're going to allocate resource better. So Manju, what do you think? Will all this lead to more efficient outcomes in cyber risk?
I think it will eventually, but right now what we're seeing, because it's so close to when the compliance date was, it hasn't even been a year, since January, since the requirement was absolute in the disclosures. Companies are definitely complying in terms of putting it in their 8Ks and all of that. But in terms of risk registers, the conversation internally for risk registers is really, let's just keep a flat catalog. So that in that sense, it's being done. Is it being driven to a wider audience? That depends on the company and the CISO and the backing. So I think there's a lot of variance in that. I do like the fact that a risk registers in the conversation now, at least, that cataloging your risk. And what that's really done, Patrick, is it's elevated the conversation that cyber is not IT, cyber is risk management, right? And so if you work in financial services, you have other things like FTC safeguards and many other regulatory things you have to worry about. But now with SEC and the cyber risk register, you're saying, okay, this is a conversation that's worthy of risk management and the audit committee and the risk catalog being mashed up with all of enterprise risk, not just in the IT realm. It's no longer just a old-fashioned SOX problem. And now it's really everything. But, in the end, a CISO can only do so much, and a CISO can only be in so many places. So while the risk register is great and we're cataloging as much as we can, there's no way we could really wrangle all the risks at the company on the cyber side. So that's where some of these things do surprise us.
That's great. I think it's wonderful too that a risk register's in the conversation. I think that's a great development. Yeah, back to the Supreme Court now. Who would have thought we'd be talking about the Supreme Court so much? But they are sort of the deciders of last resort in some ways. So
Yes.
this concept of materiality, I'm just going to frame it a little bit. When I talk to cyber professionals, last year the debate around materiality seemed to be, what does that mean? Whose materiality? Material for whom? So it was this sort of angels dancing on the head of a pin debate. But the Supreme Court, and you're a lawyer, Cara, so I'm going to throw this to you. Can you discuss a little bit about materiality? And it's a flexible concept, but have you seen it leveraged or productively talked about in discussions among leaders in any way, Cara?
Lots of discussions. I think these discussions are 50 years old about what is considered material or not. And frankly, the definition and the application changes as the risks that corporations face, evolve. And so again, this is, I think about it in a couple different vectors. First of all, whether things are material and important to your executive leadership team and your board is one decision altogether, right? Should help kind of drive investment and strategic focus on the organization. If you're also layered on top of that, a company that reports into the SEC, then you're thinking about materiality in terms of your public filings. And so, the classical definition of materiality is that, you have to release information that a reasonable investor would want to know to decide to buy or sell your stock or to vote if you have any shareholder votes. That has both qualitative and quantitative measures. So you can look at, will it cost you X number of dollars, or will this cost me some amount of customer churn? It also is, our CFO is engaged in fraud. Maybe we haven't lost any money, but that's something that an investor wants to know. Now, given the more specific reporting requirements, specific to cyber, we're trying to fit that, more classical securities law framework onto a CISO's risk register, right? And there are some things that are directly correlated and not. I do also think about materiality as a spectrum. I think there's very clearly cyber incidents that everyone knows and can point to that, giant breach going to cost us a lot of money. It's going to cost, it's going to be we're going to see a downtick on our stock price, clearly material, right? I think at the other end, you may have, small administrative breach. Someone left out some papers that they shouldn't have and they got into the wrong hands, probably easily dealt with. The tricky stuff is everything in the middle, right? And I think that's where, you can't really have a defined piece of, a definition that's static. I think it has to, be aligned with where you think your, high velocity risks are with the organization and have those lines of communication. And I think that again is, still call it in transition because because a lot of these disclosures are new. We're also seeing a little bit of, there are two ways to disclose via an 8K, via cyber risk. Like you can make an official cyber report under item 105. I think we're also seeing some companies who are making kind of reports that are not technically cyber reports, but are released as other information. And so I think there's a little bit of people trying to cover all their bases by encouraging disclosure, but I do think it's kind of an evolving area that we'll kind of continue to see how it develops.
Fascinating, really. So let's transition to the CISO, because we've obviously seen with SolarWinds, with Uber, a CISO community that is trying to get its head around sort of the change in their role. So personal liability for CISOs, and Gardner mentioned that it's going to be some indemnification. There's a trend towards greater indemnification for CISOs. So it's become a concern. How do you navigate the pressure as a CISO while maintaining an effective security strategy? Tamika.
Oh,
Yeah.
it's a very interesting answer, but I thought a lot about this, and the truth is I try not to focus on it, right? I focus on things that I can control, right? Things like risk management, and not only documenting the risk in the risk register, but communicating those risks, right? Because it doesn't mean anything if you have a risk register and nobody knows what's on it, so they're not aware of what risk exists in the environment. So documenting, communicating those risks to the board, to your risk function in your organization. I still believe security is not compliance. And I tend to focus on securing the environment, not so much focusing on the personal liability and having those concerns. But then again, I'm not a public company either. So
Right. Exactly. And we've got a great question that just popped up here in the chat. And I'll throw it out to you guys. What recommendations do you have for a CISO who wants to connect and gain a champion among the board of directors, but it's currently limited to communicating only through the CEO at the moment?
I would probably say have those conversations, talk to the CEO. The worst thing you can do is go above the CEO's head sometimes. That can get a little bit tricky. So I would say have the conversation with the CEO first and ask for that seat at the table. Ask for that opportunity to communicate to the board directly, right? Sometimes people don't allow you to communicate because they don't know that you're comfortable or you want to communicate. So I would say ask the question first, have the conversation. And if that doesn't work, then it's about finding a different path to getting that opportunity to speak directly to the board, but be very careful with, jumping over, and above the CEO's head, because that could have other consequences.
Right. Yes.
Career limiting move.
Yes.
Boards are so different, and how CEOs interact with boards is highly personal. Some CEOs really want to control the flow of information that's going to the boards and have it go through several rounds of vetting before it gets released. Other boards have much more open relationship with management, and think about even within boards, you're really going to run the spectrum of, you'll probably have a couple of people who are can dive deep into the topic of cyber and risk management, and others that are looking at a much different view because that's just not their areas of expertise. And so I think particularly in the public company space, we're seeing a lot more direct reporting to the audit committee, and then also direct reports to the board, usually like on a quarterly basis. But if you're not having that direct access, I think the first venue to maybe think about is also at a committee level as opposed to directly to the board. And then, even if it's not, a CISO directly reporting to the board, and I think preparing the reports and making sure that that you feel like that correct, the risk management is being effectively communicated is something you can work directly with the CEO or other, whoever else is reporting to the board on those topics.
It's great advice.
I'll add, Patrick, that timing is everything.
Yeah.
And you don't know what else is going on in those boardrooms. And I'd also be very intentional on how I craft that, right? Is it specific audit committee members? Is it forming a relationship with the chair of the audit committee? Or is it just the board, right? And so that's, you have to be kind of be educated on your board and how it's sliced up in what pockets and what your intent is in having that relationship. And then back to the timing is everything. You don't know if there's something else going on, M&As going on, other things going on. So there might be a reason they might not invite you at this time. It's interesting, as CISOs, we think our stuff's so important, and it's super important. But if you really get invited into a boardroom and you hear all the other discussions going on, our stuff is actually mid-tier important most of the time. It's not the top thing. It feels like it because we take our jobs really seriously and we're passionate about what we do. But if you consider all the things in a boardroom that they have to discuss, cyber is amongst them, but it's not always the top. And so craft your intentions with care and specifically. And I think, you know, if you're in financial services, you'll most likely get the backing you need.
Great. Damiano, in the chat, that was a wonderful question. I think you got some pretty expert counsel there, which is wonderful. So I just want to jump back to this idea of the indemnification of the role, because when you go onto CISO forums, you can see there's, you know, I wouldn't say it's panic, but it's concern certainly about the changing role of the CISO in light of some of this stuff, and in light of some of the enforcement actions after big incidents or breaches. Manju, I'll just throw this to you. Is the increased trend toward indemnifications a sign that the role's changing, or are CISOs getting the assurance they need after some of the high-profile cases we've seen?
First of all, I'll open with a bold statement. No one likes to feel like they're going to go to jail for doing their job. Okay, and that's really what it comes down to, right? And doing their job well most of the time, right? And so that's kind of the differentiator. CISOs are getting a lot of the backing, and the conversation's been elevated to that. It shouldn't have come to that, but it did, right? And so here we are, where we're going through those indemnification conversations and asking for it. I will say, for my CISO friends that are in the market, it's taking a little extra long when they get an offer, because there's a lot of layers of paperwork they have to do now that they didn't have to do before to protect themselves up front. And in terms of the high profile cases, I think it depends on your sector and company. Not everybody is into those cases. It affects us because it's our peers. But if you go to your general counsel, or you go to someone who has nothing to do with cyber on a day-to-day basis, they may not know about the SolarWinds case and the output of that CISO. And so it's a little bit of educating your peers internally and your board, but also, you know, making sure your protections are in place for yourself, whether you're inside a company or in your next role. They're getting a little bit of relief. I think it's really good to know that at the end of it all, while the two cases that we mentioned were dragged through the mud, that no one was actually behind bars in the end. And that's a bit of relief, but it took a lot of example to get there. And lastly, I'll say it's weird to do your job and be expected to know about every single risk everywhere, and then be blamed for it when one of the millions of risk out there was unspotted or uncurated by you specifically. And then on the punishment front, it's also weird that you would be punished for that, but nobody else in your ecosystem would be punished for that. When the funding and the backing and the headcounts come from a collective decision. So it's that's a weird experience for us, and that's kind of why we've had to create the legal structures that we do now as CISOs to be able to be fully committed and protected going into our role.
That's a wonderful answer, because before some of this, legally started happening, and it seemed to me like the incentive structure, was really tough in a way. You had maximum responsibility at the level of the CISO, but minimal authority around the actual budgeting. And then on the, governance side, you had sort of an incentive to say, oh, we don't, fully know what's going on over there. And if we do understand it, and we do begin to, have some, fiduciary responsibility, well, then we're on the hook for it too. And then it's the responsibility is spread. I think the rules were crafted a little bit to break down some of that incentive structure, which, ideally can lead to more efficient outcomes. I'm just going to throw another question out here we're getting some great questions in the chat. Are we seeing that CISOs report outside of IT and report to the board more from a risk perspective, while the CIO is reporting more on the operation? Any thoughts on that?
It's starting to change, and I'm excited to see that. It depends on where cyber has risen in the organization. I have seen CISOs reporting to the board. I've seen CISOs reporting to the CEO and president. And that means that that's a real business conversation at that point. It's no longer just an IT conversation. So I'm liking that trend. But I will say this, it's irrelevant where a CISO reports in the end. If our job is to have influence and accountability and spread accountability, right? And if in terms of doing that, you can do it much more effectively if you have the right backing and you're at the right rank and all of that. But that doesn't change the mission of taking the influence and accountability for cyber wellness away from yourself and everyone else around you. So that's, you have to be true to your mission on doing that as a CISO, regardless of your reporting structures.
Great. So, Tamika, let's just transition a little bit into what can be done. Can you talk about what approaches to aligning cyber risk and getting that aligned with business objectives? How has that, what have some techniques, worked for you as a leader in that area?
I would say probably the biggest one is communication, right? And keeping the lines of communication open, continuous communication. So being intentional about understanding the business objectives, and that requires having conversations with your colleagues in the business, right? And asking questions about their goal. I think it's also important to pay attention to corporate goals and make sure that those goals are filtering down and aligning with your cybersecurity strategy. But I would always say 100% it's communication and really having communication conversations with your colleagues in the business and understanding their needs, what they need to get done, and understanding what the corporate and the business objectives are, so that you can have that alignment.
That's great. Communication is so key, so key. So, Kara, how can security leaders work with legal counsel to ensure that their risk registers and definitions of materiality meet both the regulatory expectations and those of the board as well?
Well, I guess I'll start with a plug of be friendly to your local legal counsel. And so, I think both people who are in a CISO function and, good corporate attorneys, a good corporate attorney, whether you're working in-house or externally, your focus is to help do, effective risk mitigation for the organization to help it achieve its goals. Right. That's the same, focus of a CISO, except it's a little bit more on a vertical. And so I think, good legal counsel have that same mindset of kind of risk enabling the business. I think where we often will see kind of just gaps is just gaps in knowledge and terminology. And so, and I've certainly identified, like, there's not a lot of great materials out in the market to help educate attorneys about what effective and functioning cyber risk programs look like. It's getting better, but I think there's still room for education. And so, to the extent CISOs can help kind of partner with the organization and do some of that base level education, I think it'll help elevate those conversations. I think the other piece that's kind of interesting, right? Typically, your legal team is in charge of your privacy function, and there are heavy overlaps between both privacy and security. Those teams need to be closely interlocked to be working together, and so So I think that's just another reason to help kind of work on that baseline conversation so that everyone's kind of on the same page in terms of what's the current security posture, where are things that are, particularly, potentially unmitigated risks, and where is the organization going? And so once you have that kind of common base of understanding, I think the next level to look at is really kind of assessing and understanding what are the regulatory frameworks that you're paying attention to, right? Are you a financial services company that you're paid, it's Graham Leach Bliley? Are you more of a marketing company? You've got a lot of FCC regulations. And so I think attorneys are pretty good at understanding what the regulatory framework is. Overlying the regulatory framework with that risk register is certainly where we would need help. And again, kind of in the spirit of open and honest conversation, I think once you've got a little bit more of that mapping, then you can think more about your frameworks and certifications. And so once you know where your regulations interact with your risks, how do your whether it's your NIST framework, your ISO certs, enhance or able to kind of inform where those regulatory risks are. And so again, it's a lot of mapping. I think about a lot of it as intersecting Venn diagrams, but it's a different views of looking at regulatory risk, cyber risk, and kind of understanding where things intersect, to figure out what else needs to get done. And then I'd say probably last piece, that all can get complicated and very detailed. Probably the most important way that security and legal can work together is to help think about the right type and reporting, up to senior leadership into the board. You have to find ways to kind of simplify and summarize all that information and report it to the board so that again, people with varying degrees of sophistication can kind of review and assess where they need to be working on in terms of board governance. So easy, right?
Yeah, no, yes,
It can be done in a couple hours, right?
That's the beautiful thing about risk management. It's so simple. Yes. So,
and there's no, I think it looks different in every organization. It's the same, there are 1,000 ways to do it, which, some ways makes it interesting, but also can be overwhelming. And I think, if anything, consistent reporting and kind of consistent kind of communications is the easiest way to start.
yes, and communication again is key. And I love that you use the word mapping. That's what we do in-house here. I'm a big fan of mapping. We're always mapping for our clients and mapping. And the idea is to make this simple, communicable, reportable, to capture some complexity, obviously, and some of the individual requirements that organizations have, but also be able to sort of report in common ways across different frameworks, different requirements, and still make sense at the end of the day. So, Manju, how do you balance the compounded pressure here from evolving regulatory requirements and liability with your ongoing security initiatives and reporting obligations as a CISO?
It's a lot to balance, but I just say keep doing what you're doing. Keep doing what you're doing, what you've always done. The regulations are going to change, the landscape's going to change. That's the very definition of being a CISO or in cyber. Just go with the flow. Certainly the accountability pressures have gone up and the communication pressures have gone up. And I think in a way that's great and it's going to serve us well. But balancing it all is possible because if you keep true to your mission of serving and protecting internally and protecting the products and organization and the consumers and delivering the best outcome for a cyber safe organization. I think, it is possible to balance it all. I think in terms of regulations, though, they are getting more and more sophisticated. So at some point, we're going to have to dial down some of the old stuff that doesn't make sense anymore, right? And if you look at some of the GLBA evolutions that have happened with FTC safeguards and everything else, that's an example of the evolution and the modernization of some of those controls. So I'm looking forward to some of the modernization of those controls as well. I think when they don't necessarily catch up with the business and what the business is doing in terms of what we have today, going on today with AI and all of that puts us in a weird place where we're juggling poorly written regulations
Right.
with modern day controls and practices. And so what I'd like to see is the regulations rise to almost the speed of what we're doing. And that's going to put us in a weird place because it feels like the cart chasing the horse. But at the same time, you're also not obliged to regulations that don't make sense anymore. I'll give you a personal story. Sometimes, I've been a part of audits before where the password requirement was, 12 characters or something like that. And we had 20 characters and the auditor would say, well, but it's not 12. And that's a perfect example of, wait, but 20 is more than 12, and we did, then went to password lists. That's even better, right? And so that's an example of the regulations or the controls not matching up with our modern progress. And so that's what I ask of regulators. That will help us as CISOs. I know it's a roundabout answer, but it would help us do our jobs better when the regulations kind of modernize to some of the companies' practices that we need. Now, there's all types of companies out there, so that may have made sense for some companies, but the other auditors as well. And then in terms of balancing it all, as any executive does, but work-life balance and staying true to your mission. I'm really liking the trajectory of having the relationship with the board, though. I think that's giving us the confidence of our work matters and work does matter, and that's a good feeling.
Yeah, it's a great feeling, and I think it's a great development all in all for us in cyber. It is important what we do, and it's important that, we communicate what we're doing so that we can continue to get the resources we need to, make systems more resilient, to protect livelihoods, and ultimately, protect the country and its assets as well. So I'm going to pause here. Your answers you really have my thinking about this. Your expertise is so valuable. I just throw it around for anyone if they've got any sort of thoughts to wrap up. Tamika, do you have anything in closing?
The only thing I would say is it's a topic that's near and dear to me is just really communication is key, right? Making sure you're having the conversations that you need to be having, whether it's, letting people know what risks are are in your environment, or communicating to senior leadership around, data around breaches and cyber attacks. Whatever you need to be communicating, you need to communicate, and it's continuous communication. So, I said earlier, it's not enough to just have a risk register and have that risk register sitting there. Those risks need to be communicated up, because if not, then you're not going to get the backing that Manju talks about, because you're not communicating what you need to be communicating so that something can be done. So I that is something that's near and dear to me, communication. And that's what I would say, when all else fails, have the conversations.
Great. Kara, do you have some closing thoughts?
The SEC rules and how they are applied will continue to evolve. I think it's something people will continue to pay attention to and see where those go. I do think, right there, not everyone works for a publicly traded company, but I wouldn't discount the network effects of what SEC regulations have, right? And so even if you are a private company, if you intend to sell to the enterprise space, or even if you're selling to more government customers, you will see in your commercial side flow down provisions and security schedules that will essentially mimic what your customers have to report on. And so even if these SEC, even if you aren't specifically reporting to the SEC, I think some of the security postures and some of the governance is applicable to companies, particularly in enterprise space. And so, I think it's all under the theme of elevating the role of cyber risk in an organization, and it's while that risk continues to go upwards and to the right on our heat maps, I think we'll continue to hopefully see the elevation of the CISO role, and again, increased partnership with with all sorts of different C-level teams that are interested and really need to buy into what the CISO is doing.
Great. Manju, any parting thoughts?
Thank you, Patrick. I'll peel the banana a little bit. The SEC regulations are definitely a prompt for more companies to care and commit to cybersecurity. But if you unpeel that, what we're really saying is protect your business, protect your records, protect your consumers, right? And it matters. And in some cases, protect human identities and human lives. And if you unpeel that, I think the core message there is there's a level of commitment in both in the CISO world and even at the regulatory level to protect us. And that's something that, you know, CISOs take seriously, and that's something the government is starting to really pay attention to. So just want to, you know, tie it all up that there's a greater mission at play here. It feels wrapped up in regulation, but it is really to protect all of us and protect the tools that we use and products we use every day. So thank you for all those cyber folks out there, risk folks out there.
Well, and thank you to my panel. That was wonderful, and I feel enlightened and committed to continuing on this journey. And thank you all for being here, and thanks to the guests. This is going to wrap up our first session of the morning, and thank you, panelists. Wonderful job.
Thank you.
Take care, all.
Thank you.